Good day. Today is Sunday, 27th April 2025. Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky met in Rome, and I don't think I have ever seen such a massive PR operation swing into action directly after that meeting across the European media. Now, I say that because if you were to read the European media, not just the British media, but the media in France, Germany, and all sorts of other places, you would have thought that this was a breakthrough meeting, a massive substantive discussion between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky, that great questions of moment were decided over the course of this meeting, and that Donald Trump veered and changed his stance about the entire conflict and the situation in the war as a result of it. This, frankly, is straightforwardly wrong. I mean, there is nothing about this meeting that points to any of that. I would add that this discussion, this representation of the meeting in this extraordinary way, was combined with incredibly selective quotations from a Truth Social post that Donald Trump has published, which, as we will see, is not really at all like the way it's been represented as being. Having said this, we're getting quite a lot of information now about the Putin-Witkoff meeting from the Russian side. And there's quite a lot of information now trickling in from the Russians about the general situation with the diplomacy, which strongly suggests that the Putin-Witkoff meeting didn't go quite as well as some people perhaps hoped it would. In fact, we are essentially little further forward in the negotiations at the moment. And we've had some public comments now from Russian officials, including Peskov, but most importantly from Putin himself, which strongly suggests that they expect the war to continue and that they don't anticipate a diplomatic outcome, but rather they see the war purely in terms of an eventual military victory. But anyway, a lot to go over that, therefore. But let's first of all discuss that meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky, the one that has attracted so much attention with all the pictures and photographs and film, very selective pictures and photographs and film that have gone around the world of this particular meeting. So what exactly did take place? Well, the meeting happened in St. Peter's Basilica, the St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And apparently it took place just before the start of the funeral service for Pope Francis. Now, I'm going to here make my own quick observation. I understand that diplomacy does take place, sometimes in unusual places when leaders meet. But there is something which makes me feel very uneasy about disrupting the commemoration, or at least maybe not disrupting, but preceding the commemoration of the death of a man by discussions of this kind. I say the death of a man, it would be irrelevant what man or woman that was. In this particular case, it happened to be the Pope, but there it is. Well, maybe I'm very old-fashioned about all of this. Maybe I shouldn't dwell on the matter. But anyway, there it is. It was done in that particular way. And, well, there were aspects about this meeting which, again, the media doesn't really address very fully. Firstly, the Vatican authorities appear to have broken protocol by adjusting the places that the various world leaders sat in to make sure that Zelensky was as close to Donald Trump as possible in the first row. Now, I have to say again, I do wonder about whether that was appropriate, and it does suggest that there are officials within the Vatican who are much more sympathetic to Ukraine and its cause, or perhaps who are more subject to pressure from the Western powers than the late Pope was, something which, by the way, doesn't surprise me at all. But of course, positioning Zelensky so close to Trump would have made it easier to arrange a meeting with Trump. And the other thing, if I've understood the sequence of pictures correctly, is that we see shortly before, what I understand to be shortly before the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, pictures of Trump, Zelensky, Starmer and Macron all floating around, all together in a kind of circle. And, well, I wasn't there. I wasn't listening into their discussions. But if we put that together with what was being reported in the media before, it looked to me as if Starmer and Macron came along with Zelensky and basically buttonholed Trump and basically arranged the meeting in that kind of a way. So this is not a meeting carefully prepared through diplomats, through diplomatic contacts in advance. It looks as if very much it was an impromptu meeting, initiated by Zelensky, of course, but also facilitated by the British and the French. Basically, they came together as a group and they made it possible, or at least they ensured that Trump would speak to Zelensky. Now, there is some other photos as well, some other pictures, and I've seen photos rather than continuous film, but it looks as if 3 chairs were made available. Again, that suggests some involvement in this by the Vatican authorities, which again, I have to say, does make me uneasy, to say the least. But anyway, 3 chairs were arranged, and one of them apparently was intended for Emmanuel Macron. So it looks as if what was initially intended was that this would be a 3-party discussion: Trump, Macron, and Zelensky. Now, again, I've seen pictures and film which suggest that Trump basically shooed Macron away. He made it clear that he did not want Macron to be party to the discussion. Now, I say all of this, I want to stress again, I've seen the pictures, I've seen film, I'm not sure of the exact sequence. It may be that this sequence is entirely wrong. It may be that the incident with Macron took place after the conversation with Zelensky, not before. But I would suggest that this is the way I've outlined it is perhaps the most natural explanation of events. Anyway, the meeting then happened. We've all seen the photos of the 2 men, Trump and Zelensky, sitting in chairs, looking at each other intently, engaged in what looked like intense conversation. What very few media outlets in the West have said is that the meeting lasted all of 15 minutes. It's inconceivable that a substantive discussion can have taken place between Zelensky and Trump over such a brief period. So I don't know exactly what was discussed. We have had some reports from Ukraine which suggest a rather less, shall we say, happy picture than some reports imply. But anyway, whatever it was that the 2 said to each other, it can't have gone into the detail very far. And apparently, the Ukrainians were trying to arrange, I say the Ukrainians, the British and the French and the Ukrainians were seeking to arrange a second meeting, a meeting to take place after Pope Francis's funeral, no doubt as a follow-up, perhaps a more substantive meeting, maybe one lasting an hour or something of that kind. Except that Trump obviously was not in agreement because no such meeting took place. He seems to have gone directly from the service to the ambassadors, the US ambassadors' residence, and then gone to the airport and boarded Air Force One and flown back to the United States. Now, importantly, since that meeting, Trump himself has made no comment about it at all on Truth Social. He's posted photos of the meeting and other photos of himself in St. Peter's, quite a few photos of himself in St. Peter's on his Truth Social account, but he has given no account of the meeting himself. Usually, when he speaks, when he speaks to leaders, when he speaks to Putin, for example, or to Zelensky, if he feels that the meeting has indeed gone well, a Truth Social post describing the meeting will appear. And, well, as for the claims that this is a constructive discussion and all went well and that the two men saw eye to eye and were in agreement with each other, well, all of those reports, when you actually unpack them, all those reports but one seem to come from the Ukrainians, from Zelensky himself. This is a very positive and constructive meeting the Ukrainians are trying to imply. The media in Europe has gone wild over this and they're publicizing all of this. There has been one comment that I've been able to find from a US official, which also says that it was a constructive and positive meeting. I'm not saying that the two men quarreled or disagreed. Maybe at some level it was constructive and positive. But, again, the spin, the positive spin about the meeting goes far beyond anything that could have been discussed over a stretch of 15 minutes. And, well, as I said, I may be completely wrong about the sequencing, though there is pictures, as I said, of Trump with Macron and Zelensky and Starmer all in attendance, and there is pictures and film of Trump apparently waving Macron away. But as I said, I'm not absolutely clear about the sequencing myself. But to my mind, the silence from Trump himself and the fact that the meeting was very brief and the fact that there wasn't a second meeting tells its own story. Now, that's the meeting as it looked to me. There's also the descriptions of the meeting that we're starting to get from one or two sources in Ukraine itself. Now, the first comes from a resident, which is, as we know, one of those Ukrainian Telegram channels, very interesting, very well informed, clearly with contacts within the Ukrainian military, the senior ranks of the Ukrainian military, very critical of Zelensky himself, formerly very supportive of General Zaluzhny, the former Ukrainian military chief, who's now in de facto exile in London, where he is Ukraine's ambassador. Anyway, Resident is saying that Donald Trump, what actually happened at the meeting was that Donald Trump told Zelensky that there was just 10 days left. Unless there was some kind of ceasefire in place in 10 days' time, the United States would indeed quit the negotiations, the mediation effort, and that would be that. Now, again, that's Resident. Resident is mostly reliable. It is not absolutely reliable. It is not an official source or anything like that. And of course, one doesn't know at all whether in fact it's simply reporting gossip or that this is information that was passed down through the Ukrainian political leadership to the military, which has reached Resident and which they're reporting as well. But anyway, that is what Resident is saying, that in effect Trump gave Zelensky a 10-day ultimatum to get a ceasefire agreed with Putin as quickly as possible. And unless that happened, well, the United States would finally walk away. Now, another Ukrainian has spoken, not directly about the meeting itself, but about the general state of negotiations between Ukraine, the United States, and Russia. And that is Kuleba, who was the former Ukrainian foreign minister, who, shall we say, was dismissed on relatively good terms by Zelensky a few months ago, and who's been, by the way, very busy commenting about things on the Ukrainian media and to the media in the West. And I get the impression that Kuleba, who has clearly not broken with Zelensky or with the Ukrainian government, is relatively well informed about things in Ukraine, about political events in Ukraine. Anyway, Kuleba is saying that there has been no substantive progress in the negotiations at all. And in fact, we are exactly where we were in the autumn of last year. There are a lot of ideas have been bounced backwards and forwards, but nobody has really shifted ground. And we are no closer, in fact, to an actual agreement, an agreement which Russia and Ukraine could both agree to, and which would, in fact, genuinely bring the conflict to an end, than we were before Donald Trump became president. Now, that doesn't suggest a particularly good meeting between Zelensky and Trump, and it doesn't suggest that the Ukrainians are happy with the direction the negotiations are taking. Anyway, that's from the Ukrainian side. And as I said, there are complications and things. As I said, there's all kinds of claims in the media in the West. But let's actually now go to the one Truth social post from Donald Trump, which we do actually have. Now, as I said, it's been reported very selectively. It appeared, as far as I can tell, before the meeting in Rome. And some people are assuming that this true social post, which is as usual very, very long, was provoked by irritation and anger with Putin, specifically anger over the Russian missile strike on Kiev, which took place, I think it was two or 3 days ago. Now, I think there may be some reason why there might have been some irritation on Trump's side with the Russians. Just as Trump has said nothing on Truth Social about his conversation with Zelensky, at least not so far. And the very fact that there's been a delay, even if he does eventually say something, but to my mind, if he felt that the meeting had gone well, that some real progress had been made over the course of it, I suspect that since we're talking about Donald Trump, he would have rushed out some comment about how well the whole discussion was going up to this time. Anyway, just as we have had nothing from Trump about his conversation with Zelensky, we have had nothing from Trump about Witkoff's meeting with Putin. Now, the Russians have quite obviously been complaining about the fact that the Americans and the Ukrainians have been discussing in public the subject of negotiations that are taking place between Russia and the United States, and between the United States and the Ukrainians. There are, for the moment, by the way, no discussions of any kind, no diplomacy at all between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Just to say, purely at the moment it's purely a discussion between the Americans and the Russians. The Russians have expressed annoyance about this. We had Lavrov. I discussed his comment yesterday, in which he said that the Russians are polite people. They don't believe in talking about things publicly which are being negotiated about. They regard publication of the details of negotiations which are underway as a sign that negotiations aren't being taken seriously. When I mentioned that comment of Lavrov's yesterday, I pointed out that he'd actually referenced Zelensky about that comment. But I can't help but feel, thinking about this further, that the Russians, Lavrov, were also perhaps hinting at irritation with the United States, the Trump administration, perhaps even Donald Trump himself, concerning the fact that what they say in private to Witkoff and to other American officials then gets reported in the New York Times on the following day, or discussed by Trump, or at least alluded to by Trump in his next Truth social post. So it may be that the Americans have taken on some of this criticism from the Russians and are now tightening their own control of the leaking of information. I have to say, I don't think this is very likely. I don't think the United States, the Trump administration, is going to be affected in its conduct of how it conducts its own public relations and media operation by Russian concerns. That doesn't seem to me in character, not just with this administration, but with any US administration. The Americans always rush out and give their own spin on discussions and leak quite a lot of things about the substance of discussions that they engage in, even when those discussions are supposed to be confidential. You can go all the way back, for example, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Kennedy administration rushed out its own version of the agreement that had been reached with the Russians to de-escalate the crisis in 1962, the one that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, whereas the Russians had apparently expected that much of the agreement would remain secret, and they observed their own part of the bargain to keep the agreement, the American agreement, to withdraw medium-range missiles from Italy and Turkey, secret, something which was only fully acknowledged, to my knowledge, sometime around the 1980s. Just saying. So this isn't a new thing, and I can't really imagine Donald Trump or Witkoff or Rubio or any of the others simply holding back on information simply because the Russians want them to. So the fact, again, that Trump hasn't said anything positive about the meeting with Witkoff, between Putin and Witkoff, suggests to me that he might be disappointed by the way that meeting went. And I'm going to suggest that information from the Russians might provide some explanation as to why he might be disappointed with the course of that meeting. But in the meantime, if we go back to this Truth Social post, can I just say, if you read it through, the part of the Truth Social post that the European media especially has honed in on is the part that comes at the very end, in which Trump complains that the fact that the Russians conducted what he calls an unnecessary giant missile strike on Kiev is annoying and calls into question their commitment to peace, and makes him wonder whether they are just stringing him along, in which case he might seriously consider banking and secondary sanctions, further banking and secondary sanctions against Russia. That is right at the end of the Truth Social post. But 3/4 of the Truth Social post is about something completely different. And most of it, well, I'll read it. It starts with these words: no matter what deal I make with respect to Russia, Ukraine, no matter how good it is, even if it's the greatest deal ever made, the failing New York Times will speak badly of it. Little Peter Baker, the very biased and untalented writer for the Times, followed his editor's demands and wrote that Ukraine should get back territory, including, I suppose, Crimea and other ridiculous requests, in order to stop the killing that is worse than anything since World War II. Why doesn't this lightweight reporter say that it was Obama who made it possible for Russia to steal Crimea from Ukraine without even a shot being fired? It was also little Peter who wrote an absolutely fawning yet terribly written biography on Obama. It was a joke. Did Baker ever criticize the Obama Crimea giveaway? No, not once. Only Trump, and I've had nothing to do with this stupid war other than early on when I gave Ukraine javelins and Obama gave them sheets. This is sleepy Joe Biden's war, not mine. It was a loser from day one and should have never happened and wouldn't have happened if I were president. I'm just trying to clean up the mess that was left to me by Obama and Biden. And it just goes on like that. So this is a Truth Social post, obviously provoked by Trump's anger about an article criticizing his peacemaking attempts in the New York Times. The fact that the New York Times, together with pretty much every other part of the Western media, is criticizing him for making excessive concessions to the Russians. And perhaps those who latch onto this Truth Social post, and that part of the Truth Social post in which Trump talks about the fact that Putin might be stringing him along and that Trump might be looking to impose banking and secondary sanctions on the Russians, they might consider that Trump says that making demands of the Russians to return Crimea to Ukraine is a ridiculous request, that the war is a loser from day one. In other words, that this is a losing war, that the war is entirely Obama's and Biden's responsibility, that if it had been left to him, it would never have happened at all, and that he has been trying to sort out the mess which Obama and Biden have bequeathed to him. In other words, Trump is saying Ukraine is never going to get Crimea back, suggesting that it will, or that it will get back any of its other territory, is ridiculous. It will prolong the war, and the war is a losing proposition anyway. In other words, it was being lost and is being lost. If you focus on those words, then your feeling about this entire Truth Social post might change. It might seem that the words about Putin stringing Trump along, which appear at the very end of the Truth Social post essentially as an afterthought, don't quite bear the weight that some people are placing on them. Now, Trump, over the last couple of weeks, in fact, ever since he became president, was inaugurated president in January, has been repeatedly playing a game of appearing to criticize Putin and the Russians from time to time, of making threats against the Russians of sanctions from time to time. These criticisms and these threats provoke Russian shrugs. There's no sign that they're influenced to change their behavior as a result of them in any way. And I can't help but think that what Trump is doing here is balancing, or trying to balance, criticism of the Ukrainians and of Zelensky, and in this case of the New York Times, with criticism of Putin and the Russians, in order to avoid the impression that he is biased or prejudiced in Russia's favor and is therefore making excessive concessions to the Russians. The media is full of the last claim. Trump doesn't want that story to gain traction, that claim to gain traction. So he does what politicians ever do, and it is annoying, but they do it, all of them do, which is that they try to cover their position by making criticism and combining it with empty threats in order to make it clear that they're not really biased in the way that the media says. However, I am going to say something here, which is that looking at this in the light of what I've now been hearing come out of Russia, I can start to see why Trump might feel that things did not go quite as well in the meeting between Witkoff and Putin on Friday, as perhaps he expected. Firstly, we've had a number of public comments from some Russian officials. So, firstly, Peskov has been speaking, and he spoke again to Pavel Zarubin, as I said, Putin's favorite reporter, somebody who's very, very close to Putin, somebody who, as I have said, can all but be considered a member of Putin's team. And when the Russian leadership speaks to Zarubin, basically these are arranged discussions, arranged interviews used by the Kremlin as a vehicle to provide official statements. So Peskov said to Zarubin that the work is ongoing. Now, preliminary, it is too early to talk about any terms, and work cannot be carried out in any public format. And this comment of Peskov's was made in answer to a question about President Trump's statements on the whole topic of the negotiations. Trump endlessly gives an optimistic spin to the way in which the negotiations have been going. And Peskov said, well, hold on. It's too early to talk about that. We're still having discussions. It's all preliminary. It's too early to talk about any terms. We're nowhere near close to agreeing terms. We're simply exchanging ideas and having discussions. These discussions are helpful and useful and are taking us in the right direction, but we're nowhere close to the point where we can come forward and speak to the media and say, well, a deal is indeed round the corner, in the way that President Trump, Donald Trump, has been repeatedly saying. So that was one thing that Peskov said, but Peskov said something else as well. He said that during yesterday's conversation with Trump's envoy Witkoff, this interview with Zarubin took place yesterday. During yesterday's conversation with Trump's envoy Witkoff, the conversation happened on Friday, but as I said, this conversation between Peskov and Zarubin took place yesterday, that is to say, on Saturday. Vladimir Putin reiterated that the Russian side is ready to resume the negotiation process with Ukraine without any preconditions. Putin repeatedly stated this. Now, I am going to make a suggestion that what perhaps happened was that after what took place in Paris and London, after the Americans presented their proposal to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans in Paris and London on Tuesday and Wednesday, Witkoff came to Moscow, and Trump was expecting that based on what the Americans were now conceding, that that the United States would recognize de jure Crimea as Russian territory and de facto all the territory that the Russians control as Russian. Trump expected, or perhaps more properly hoped, and may have instructed Witkoff to seek a Russian commitment to a ceasefire. And Putin obviously said no, we're not prepared to agree to a ceasefire. These are your proposals. They do move in the right direction, but there's clearly a huge amount of work to do. And besides, the Ukrainians and the Europeans anyway are rejecting them. And as we've seen with the energy truce and the Easter ceasefire, the Ukrainians cannot be relied upon, they cannot be trusted to observe ceasefires. So what I think Putin said to Witkoff is, look, we've moved forward, we've got some points now where we are essentially in agreement about NATO, about who should control territory, about that kind of thing. The right thing now is to move forward with negotiations directly between the Ukrainians and ourselves. And out of those negotiations, perhaps a ceasefire might come. Now, Trump, after the Witkoff-Putin meeting, then went on to publish a Truce social post. I believe it was after. It might have been before. As I said, it's not always easy to get an exact sense of the time, but around the same time as the Witkoff-Putin meeting, the Russians have probably been talking about the need for negotiations between themselves and the Ukrainians for some time. But Trump published a comment saying that it's now time for the Ukrainians and the Russians to meet at the highest level and to take this thing forward and to move forward towards a peace. So at some level, he is heeding what the Russians are saying. But let's go back to Peskov's statement, because Peskov says that Putin repeatedly stated this. In other words, again and again over the discussion with Witkoff, one which we know lasted 3.5 hours, Putin reminded Witkoff that the Russians are prepared to sit down and talk with the Ukrainians without preconditions. Now that suggests to me that there was, if not a row, at least a disagreement. The Americans came with something else, and they were repeatedly putting pressure on the Russians to agree to it. And the Russians were pushing back, and they were saying they can't agree to it. What the situation calls for now is not what the Americans are asking for, but actual proper negotiations between the Ukrainians and themselves. And the only thing I can think of that the Americans could have come with to Moscow, which the Russians would have rejected, would have been a ceasefire. And this then brings us back to that Telegram post by the resident Telegram channel in Ukraine, which says that Trump gave Zelensky a 10-day ultimatum, get a ceasefire within 10 days, or we're walking out. Most probably, this is my guess, after Witkoff got back from Moscow and told Trump what the response of the Russians was. No, they're not prepared to grant a ceasefire, not at this stage, that there has to be a meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians first, that there have to be substantive negotiations underway between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The American framework document can form a starting point for those negotiations, which might eventually lead to a ceasefire, but there cannot be negotiations unless there cannot be a ceasefire unless those negotiations are underway. I suspect that what Trump then told Zelensky and what he said to him in Rome and what the post by resident is in effect alluding to is that Trump said to Zelensky, look, the time has now come when you must reopen negotiations with the Russians, and I want you to do that right away, and I want a ceasefire agreed within 10 days, because if it is not, then the United States will indeed walk away. That, it seems to me, is the most likely explanation of what happened. Now, having said that, and can I just accept, by the way, and say in advance, before people jump in, that this is inference from what the Russians are saying, from what the Americans are saying, from what, or not saying, from what the Ukrainians are saying as well. That there's no doubt at all that the Russians repeatedly told Witkoff that the moment has come for direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. Of that we can be certain, because we have it officially from Peskov, that it seems to me explains all of the rest. But I do acknowledge that there is a great deal of inference, if you like, on my part here. But if you put all the pieces together, it seems to me that this is by far the best explanation of where this is all going. Now, and of what has happened. Now, the point is that, as the Russians never failed to point out, they have never at any time refused to negotiate with Ukraine. They began negotiations the day after the special military operation began. There were intense negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Belarus, and then in Istanbul, in Turkey, throughout February, March 2022. The negotiations eventually led to a draft agreement, which was the Istanbul agreement. It looked as if the two sides had reached a consensus. The Ukrainians initialed the draft of the Istanbul Agreement. There was supposed to be a Russian response to the draft, which was, properly speaking, a Ukrainian proposal, a point that the Russians never failed to point out. The Russians then did indeed prepare and present a draft response to the Istanbul draft over the course of the next few weeks. I seem to remember that it was sent about 2 weeks after the initial agreement in Istanbul. So, I mean, there clearly were things to sort out and iron out, but as I said, the Russians sent their own proposals, written proposals, as to how that was supposed to be done. And at that time, the Russians envisaged that there would probably be a follow-up meeting attended by Putin and Zelensky themselves, and that this would take the form of a kind of Russian-Ukrainian summit meeting at the president's level, and then there would be a final agreement which the two sides would formally sign and which would then be ratified or presented to the two parliaments for ratification, bringing the conflict in Ukraine to an end. So that was the sequence. And as I said, the Russians sent their draft with their proposed changes and amendments to the Istanbul draft. I remember the whole sequence playing out in April, and the Ukrainians ignored it. And I remember that the Russians then sent several inquiries to Ukraine saying, did you receive the draft that we sent you? Have you any comments to make about it? And the Ukrainians simply ignored all of those further requests for information from the Russians. The Russian Foreign Ministry expressed surprise and irritation about this. Lavrov, in turn, made various public comments about this, all of which have been ignored or forgotten in the West. And there was no further move towards negotiations by the Ukrainians until in October 2022, Zelensky published his disastrous decree in which he ruled out negotiations with the Russians entirely, unless President Putin stepped down. And then at around that time, or maybe shortly after, he unveiled his so-called peace plan, which is clearly coordinated, by the way, with the Europeans and with the Biden administration, which, as I've discussed in many places, was really a demand for Russia's unconditional capitulation. And those two announcements, those two decisions by Zelensky in Kiev, the decision, the decree prohibiting negotiations, and the announcement of Zelensky's peace plan brought the entire process of diplomatic contact and negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to an end. Now, the Russians, ever since, as they have never ceased to remind people, were not the people to end the negotiation process with the Ukrainians. And the Russians, again, as they have never ceased to remind people, anybody who asks, the Brazilians and the Chinese and the Indians back in the autumn of last year, the Americans, anybody who brings up this topic, the Russians have always said that just as they were open to negotiations with Ukraine in February, March 2022, So they have been open to negotiations with the Ukrainians ever since. They are fully willing to conduct negotiations with the Ukrainians. They have a huge question mark over Zelensky's status, or at least they publicly say that they do. They've cast doubt on whether Zelensky is in a constitutional position to sign any peace settlement agreement. I'm not going to discuss this. As I said, I've expressed my own skepticism about the Russian comments, but I know others take a different view. But the Russians formally, and not just formally, publicly, have always said that they aren't prepared to enter into negotiations with the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainian position has been completely different. The Ukrainians say that they are not prepared to enter into negotiations, direct substantive negotiations with the Russians. Zelensky's decree of October 2022 remains in place. He shows no sign of being prepared to revoke it. But what he has said, and he's only said it, by the way, over the last couple of weeks, following under immense pressure from the Americans and connected to the agreement by the Ukrainians under American pressure in March to an unconditional ceasefire. Zelensky has said that Ukraine would consider negotiations with the Russians if a ceasefire were in place. And in fact, that is exactly what is provided for in the European position paper, the counter-proposal by the Europeans to the American proposal, which I discussed at length in my program, which I made on Friday. So that's the Ukrainian position. They're not prepared to enter into direct talks with the Russians. They say there has to be a ceasefire first. The Russians say the situation is not ripe for a ceasefire, but there is no reason why negotiations cannot take place without a ceasefire. After all, that was what happened in February, March 2022. That is what has happened in many conflicts. There's no reason why it cannot happen now. In fact, it is far more commonly the practice than insisting on a ceasefire before negotiations take place. And of course, the Russians have also said that ceasefires, based on the previous history, are not really a way to settle this conflict, because the previous history shows that all that happens is that the Ukrainians simply spin out the talks indefinitely, can never be pinned down to a final agreement that satisfies Russian terms, will almost certainly, with the backing of the French and the British, make demands that are unreasonable and impossible, and which the Russians are inevitably going to reject. And anyway, that is a route to a frozen conflict, not a route to a final settlement. So I think this is an unbridgeable gap. If it is true that Trump did ask Zelensky, did tell Zelensky to get moving, to start negotiations with the Russians, his Truce social post, in which he says that the Ukrainians and the Russians need to meet, including at the highest level, to take the process forward, strongly suggests this. And that's another reason, by the way, why I'm reasonably sure that my inferences about the state of the discussions is correct. Anyway, if this is so, then, as I said, it would make sense Trump wants to extricate the United States and himself from this conflict. He wants a ceasefire in order to be able to say, well, I've managed that. The situation is deteriorating further. I'm the great peacemaker. I'm able to move on. The United States isn't risking disaster if we just move on. The Russians have told him, we are not prepared to enter into a ceasefire simply because you've made some interesting discussion points. But we are willing, as we have always said, to talk to the Ukrainians. And I can very well imagine that that is what Trump said to Zelensky when they met in Rome. And probably it's all that Trump said to Zelensky when they met in Rome. Now, I'm going to say straightforwardly, if that's correct, then I can't imagine that the Ukrainians are going to change their position and agree to meet with the Russians without getting a ceasefire first. And at that point, it seems to me that we're going to be finally in the position when the negotiations finally break down. Now, that might explain the irritation that we saw from Trump in that Truth social post. The Russians refusing to agree to a ceasefire. He's already made clear his anger with the Russian missile attack on Kiev. He's frustrated because the Russians won't agree to a ceasefire. The Ukrainians harp on about a ceasefire now, disregarding the fact that they resisted the idea of a ceasefire before. The British, the French, the Europeans harp on about that ceasefire as well. Trump by now probably understands that it is unachievable. He's irritated with the Russians because they're saying this, but he does seem to understand that without negotiations, direct negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians, that isn't going to happen. But he's let his irritation show in this Truth Social post. Now, what about the threat of further banking sanctions and secondary sanctions against Russia? Our old friend, Lindsey Graham, has again been talking about how there's overwhelming support in Congress for the crushing sanctions that he proposes to impose on the Russians, that Congress is proposing to impose on the Russians if they don't make moves towards a just and fair peace, which of course in Lindsey Graham's universe means a Russian capitulation to Ukraine. Anyway, what about those sanctions? What about Trump's threat of sanctions? Well, Trump talks about banking sanctions and secondary sanctions. What banking sanctions exactly does he have in mind? Is he talking about disconnecting Russian banks from SWIFT, for example, or preventing Russian banks processing dollar payments? Because, as we know, that has already happened. Is he talking about freezing the Russian central bank's assets in the West because they're already frozen? I'm not sure what sanctions, further banking sanctions, Donald Trump could possibly be thinking about. As far as I can see, the Russian banking system now is sanctioned to the limit. There are, I know, a few Russian banks that are still able to operate outside the sanctions regime, but they're very few, and they're small banks, and I don't think one should take that especially seriously. And to all intents and purposes, Russia is cut off from the Western banking system. But just to say, Western issued credit cards by MasterCard and Visa for example, do not work in Russia, and Western cards do not work in Russian ATMs. So again, I'm not sure what Trump is talking about. Is he talking about the confiscation of the frozen Russian assets? Well, maybe, but that's a massive can of worms. Probably his own legal people, if assuming he pays any attention to them, have told him as much. The French government at one point seemed keen on that idea, but has basically stepped back from it. Besides, seizing the Russian central bank assets are not going to make any difference for the Russians to what is happening already. So I don't know what banking sanctions Donald Trump has in mind. Maybe he knows something that I don't, but I can't see that banking sanctions at this stage in the conflict are going to impress or deter the Russians in the slightest. And as for secondary sanctions to block Russian oil exports, it would be impossible to overstate how deeply unpopular with the global community those would be. Many countries rely on Russia for oil and other supplies, India for one. Doing something like that would provoke undoubtedly, or cause undoubtedly, further increases in energy prices. And Donald Trump is talking about how successful he has been through his tariff policy in lowering oil prices. So I wouldn't have thought that he'd want to reverse them. And of course, upward pressure on oil prices will presumably spark more inflation. And this at a time when Donald Trump is made very clear his unhappiness with the fact that the Federal Reserve Board, despite what he says is falling inflation, is showing reluctance to cut American interest rates. So, this doesn't seem on its face to be a particularly good idea to me. And besides, it wouldn't work anyway. As I have already discussed in many programs now, the main buyer of Russian oil is China. The biggest buyer is China. India is a very important secondary buyer. I cannot imagine China scaling back its purchases of Russian oil. Trump has already preempted his own secondary sanctions against China by imposing colossal tariffs on China. And he seems to be trying to walk those tariffs back, though he's doing so in a very complicated way. I'm not going to discuss that in this program. And, well, if he wants to reduce the tariffs on China and to resume trade with China, then presumably he's not going to impose secondary sanctions against China if they start buying Russian oil, which will simply make the tariffs go up again. I mean, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. And if we're talking about India, well, India is in the moment in an immense crisis with Pakistan, but it has, over the last few weeks, increased its purchases of Russian oil. It has to forego Russian oil, and oil prices in India rise. That's going to cause severe economic stress within the Indian economy, and that could affect Prime Minister Modi's popularity. And anyway, to cut it short, it would not be popular with the Indian government. Of course, you can go down and do even more extreme things. You can try to seize Russian ships or tankers ferrying Russian oil on the high seas. You could try and blockade Russian ports, do those kind of things. But then, of course, you risk getting into a direct military confrontation if the Russians start to push back against such a blockade. Is that really where you want to go? Now, a couple of days ago, about last week, there was a good article in a British, relatively new British magazine called Unheard about this whole topic. It written by Jennifer Kavanagh, and it said Putin's military escalation shows Trump has no leverage, and it then goes on to say, though often suggested by European allies and US-Russia hawks, neither new sanctions nor more American military aid to Ukraine is likely to change Putin's calculus. Over the past 3 years, Russia's economy has proved its resilience to repeated rounds of economic restrictions, and Putin himself seems largely unresponsive to additional economic punishments. The threat of more US military aid to Ukraine will be even less persuasive, not least because the United States has already admitted that its depleted stockpiles leave it little capacity to surge military assistance. With the belief that US pushback is unlikely and that Russia is immune to any consequence that might arise, Putin has every incentive to press his military advantage as far as possible while remaining rhetorically committed to peace. Now, I think this is absolutely correct. I mean, I wouldn't put it as dogmatically in terms of Putin's intentions as this article does. I think that the Russians, as I've discussed many times and in many places, or at least Putin and his immediate circle, would still be interested in a negotiated solution to this conflict, but they're not going to be pressured by threats of sanctions into agreeing to one. This is too important a conflict for that, at least as far as the Russians are concerned. And they believe that they have now safeguarded themselves against what the Americans can do. And they also believe, and I think here rightly, that American secondary sanctions against energy exports, Russian energy exports, ultimately are counterproductive for the United States itself and won't be effective. I've discussed in many places why I think Russia anyway is in a stronger position to absorb pressures on its energy exports, even if these are interrupted, than many people in the West understand. That this is a smaller proportion, a much smaller proportion of the Russian economy than many people in the West imagine it to be. Anyway, there we are. That is where I think we are at the moment. I think Trump is irritated and annoyed because the Russians won't agree to a ceasefire. I think that he very much wants this thing to end quickly. I think he wants the conflict to be the fighting to be brought to a stop by an early ceasefire. He wants to do that in order to score a political win and to extricate the United States from what, in his Truth social post, he has admitted is a losing war. It's strange how people have overlooked that. But the Russians believe themselves to be in a position of advantage. They sense that Trump has no leverage over them, and they're in a position to dig in. And I think we've now reached the point where they are digging in. Now, I will quickly, before I turn to further things that have been coming out of Russia, further comments that have been coming out of Russia, I will just say one further thing that came out of the meeting in Rome. The Estonian Prime Minister has come out and made various comments about things that Donald Trump said in private to this person. Trump apparently gave reassurances that the United States would not walk away from the negotiations, that the United States is indefinitely committed to the negotiations and all of that. Now, Trump has not made any reference to this conversation either on his Truce Social on Truth Social, and as far as I know, there is no official American comment about this conversation or alleged conversation anywhere. I know there are some people who believe that the conversation never took place. I suspect it did. My understanding is that the Estonian Prime Minister and Trump were close to each other, and apparently the Prime Minister tried to speak to Trump and tried to get him to agree to various things, and more likely than not, Trump, who was probably by this point getting very irritated with all of these people, Starmer, Macron, the Estonian Prime Minister, Zelensky, or the Vatican Secretariat, all of these people, all trying to get him to make commitments, to engage in diplomacy at what was, after all, supposed to be the funeral of the Pope. Anyway, it's probable that Trump said a few things basically to get this annoying individual off his back. And I suspect this person has taken those things away and is claiming that they were more important than they really were. I don't think that real substantive discussions actually take place in this kind of way. And I think any commitment that Trump is supposed to have made over what appears to have been a rather testy, informal chat is not really a commitment at all. Now, let's go back to the Russians and look further at what has been coming out of Moscow. Now, one of my sources, I say one of my sources, a key source who has been providing me with a lot of information over the course of the last 2 years, there was undoubtedly significant amount of contacts in Russia. I am saying nothing which I hope will identify this person. Anyway, this person is telling me that there is a big intelligence report that the Russian intelligence community has provided both to Putin and which has been circulated by the Kremlin to officials of the Russian parliament. And this intelligence report says a number of things. Firstly, it says that any agreement entered into with the United States at this stage in the conflict is not going to be worth the paper it is written on. Donald Trump himself might generally be committed to this agreement, but not only will the Ukrainians themselves show no regard for it, but no future American administration will feel bound by it either. It could easily walk it back. All the agreements could be walked back, even agreements about recognizing Crimea as part of Russian territory and the 4 regions as part of Russian territory. And of course, the commitment, the pledge that Ukraine will never join NATO, that too cannot be taken seriously either. And, well, I've already spoken in several programs about how the American proposal, simply saying that Ukraine will not join NATO, really doesn't take us very far, because that exact commitment has been made many times in many places in the past until 2008, when it was just reversed. So there's no reason to think that that might not happen again in the future. Well, obviously, the Russian intelligence community is pointing out to that. But as it happens, the New York Times is now saying that in the midst of all the shock and anger and horror that there was on Tuesday and Wednesday in Paris and London, after the Europeans and the Ukrainians saw the American position paper, the American proposal, US officials, and this I am sure refers to General Kellogg, who to my knowledge was the only senior American official who remained behind in London after Witkoff and Rubio left. Anyway, American officials apparently tried to calm the Ukrainians by telling them, look, Donald Trump is set against you ever joining NATO. It's never going to happen whilst he is president. But if you sign up to this agreement, well, don't worry, because the next administration might take an entirely different view and might reverse course and say that Ukraine should be part of NATO after all. So those comments were made probably before, or rather after, the Russian intelligence community would have submitted this very same report that I'm talking about. So the Russian intelligence people are apparently telling Putin, and the Kremlin is telling the Russian parliament, look, the Americans are coming up with all these interesting ideas, but really there's absolutely nothing of substance here. If we're going to move forward with the negotiation, a lot of things really do need to be ironed out. These commitments that we're getting are simply not cast iron. And apparently, the Russian intelligence community also said that the only way an agreement of this kind could be made to work is if the Americans are prepared to revisit the proposals the Russians made in December 2021 and agreed to withdraw all their military infrastructure from Eastern Europe back to the locations that they had prior to 1998. Now, that is a very, very tall order. I can't imagine even Donald Trump finding that easy to concede, and it could very well be that if the Russians really believe that that is the only way that this can all be brought together, that they can get the kind of agreement that would really satisfy Russian security interests. Well, to my mind, that generally points to the need to continue the war. Now, the same report apparently also says that the Russian intelligence community has reassessed Ukraine's ability to sustain the war. They'd previously thought that Ukraine might be able to continue the war for a further 18 to 30 months. That's more than 2 years. But they now think that, in fact, they overestimated Ukraine's staying ability, and that it could be that Ukraine is much closer to a military crisis than had been assessed before, and that the collapse might come as soon as 8 to 10 months from now. Now, there are reasons to think that might be true from the military situation, which I will come to briefly. But I would also say that there is a escalating economic crisis in Ukraine. Ukraine has failed to come to an agreement with its creditors to restructure part of its debt. $2.6 billion of debt, which fall due, I believe, next month. We are probably quite close to default. We've been, of course, close to default before, but on previous occasions, the Western powers have stepped in and provided funding to prevent that. It looks less likely that will happen this time because of the reluctance by donors in the West, and in particular the United States, to go on giving money to Ukraine. Secondly, it looks as if Ukraine is back in recession. Now, Ukraine's GDP shrank by about 30% directly after the start of the special military operation. Huge transfers of funds from the West have cloaked the effect of that, have at times given an impression of economic growth, which is not based on any real organic growth within the economy. But with that growth, with that aid from the West now starting to reduce, the cracks are beginning to show. The budget deficit has swollen to enormous dimensions. There's difficulties covering the budget, which is one reason why we're now looking at a possible default. And, well, that's a major emerging problem. The other thing is that, as some of us may remember, Zelensky stopped gas transit from Russia to Europe back in January. Whereas he stopped it, he refused to renew the contract whereby Russia exported gas to Europe across pipelines crossing Ukraine. And as I've said in many programs, that was apparently instigated by the European Commission as a means to put pressure on Orban and Fico, which has, by the way, failed. But the effect has been that apparently Ukraine is now literally out of gas. Latest reports suggest that Ukraine's enormous gas storage facilities are empty. There is no gas that can be safely extracted from them. The only gas Ukraine receives is from Europe. And of course, the problem with that is that Europe itself, in a few months, is going to be short of gas. Anyway, I'm not going to look at the military situation in this program. I will simply say that we've had significant developments over the last few hours. There are more reports. I know people always push back about this, but there are more reports that now we are literally on the brink in Chasiv Yar, that the Russians have not only largely cleared the central citadel area of Chasiv Yar, but that they've entered the two remaining micro-districts. The Ukrainians have fought for Chasiv Yar far longer, again, than it was wise for them to do. They suffered horrible attrition as a result. The Russians have never committed large forces to Chasiv Yar. But it does look at last as if this battle is indeed drawing to an end. And the Russians continue more advances around Pokrovsk and in the area between Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, and in the area thereabouts, south of Konstantinovka. But the biggest, most dramatic piece of information is from the northern border areas. Now, yesterday, Putin received a massive report from the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, who also happens to be the overall commander-in-chief of the Russian forces conducting the operation in the area of the special military operation. Now, Gerasimov informed Putin that the Russians have now captured the village of Gornal. That means that all populated areas within Kursk region are now under Russian control. Gerasimov also said that the Russians have driven the Ukrainians out of Popovka and Demidovka in the Belgorod regions. The Ukrainians, by the way, still do control some empty woods and fields in both Kursk and Belgorod regions, but they no longer control any populated areas there. The battle for Kursk and Belgorod regions is over, and it has ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Ukrainians. Gerasimov also confirmed that the Russians are now intending to establish a permanent positions in Sumy region, as they have in Kharkiv region, supposedly to act as a buffer zone. I'm not going to discuss what that means in this program. Gerasimov also confirmed, finally, that the rumors of the commitment of North Korean troops to the fighting in Kursk region were true. Now, I've discussed this in many places. I've said that information about the presence of these North Korean soldiers that have come from the American sources and the Ukrainian sources have been unreliable, to say the least, and extremely elusive. But a source from Russia has spoken to me extensively about these North Korean soldiers. He's told me about how the Russians were concerned about some of their training and some of their approach to war, that there were health issues with these soldiers, that their training was out of date, and that they also had a degree of ideological fervor and a recklessness about their willingness to fight that the Russians actually found disturbing. And by the way, Gerasimov, it seems to me, in his comments, essentially corroborates what this source said. He speaks about soldiers and officers of the Korean People's Army carrying out combat missions shoulder to shoulder with Russian servicemen, displaying high professionalism, fortitude, courage, and heroism in repulsing the Ukrainian invasion. And I've heard elsewhere other comments from other Russian officials now that the whole topic of North Korean troops in Kursk can finally be openly talked about in Russia, which speaks about how these troops showed a complete disregard for their own lives in pressing home attacks, something which the Russians were unsettled by. But put that aside, put all of those topics aside, and I will come back to Gerasimov's report later in subsequent programs. But look at what Putin said in response. He noted the success of the Russian troops in liberating Kursk region and in achieving the great victory there. He congratulated the Russian troops on their victory. And then he said this: the complete defeat of the enemy in the Kursk border area creates conditions for further successful actions by our troops in other important sectors of the front, bringing the defeat of the neo-Nazi regime closer. Now, those words were made shortly after the meeting with Witkoff. Now, let's just quickly unpack them, because here we see Putin talking about how the fact that the Ukrainians have been defeated in Kursk creates conditions for further successful actions by our troops in other important sectors of the front. Doesn't look as if Putin expects the Russian offensive, which, as I said, is steadily gaining momentum, to be called off anytime soon. That's one thing. But then he speaks about the defeat of the neo-Nazi regime closer. That suggests to me that Putin, unless he is misdirecting his own military, which I don't for a moment believe, that Putin, despite all of the things that he's heard from the Americans, that Putin believes that this war is going to end through a military victory, bringing about what he calls the defeat of what he also calls the neo-Nazi regime. He expects the enemy to be defeated, not for there just to be a negotiated outcome. And of course, the words he uses to describe the enemy, the neo-Nazi regime, to my mind, makes it impossible to imagine that there will ever be a peace agreement. Because if that is what Putin believes the government in Kiev to be, a neo-Nazi regime, how can he possibly compromise with it? What room for compromise with it does in fact actually exist? Well, there we are. My own view is that Donald Trump, at some level, is right. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians have been stringing him along in a kind of a way. Neither has wanted to reject his peace proposals outright, but neither really believes in an end to the conflict. The Ukrainians want Trump to remain committed to their cause. In fact, they want the United States to escalate even further in its support of Ukraine against Russia. The Russians, by contrast, see a chance to persuade Donald Trump to do the precise opposite, to de-escalate support for Ukraine once he has fully come to understand how impossible the regime is in Kiev, how completely irrational it is, and how unconducive it is to negotiations. I think the Russians are much closer to achieving their objective than the Ukrainians are. I ought to say that there are other things that were contained apparently in that intelligence report provided by the Russian intelligence community about the limits of American military power, the limits the United States has to sustain the war in Ukraine. The United States is now basically up against those limits. And this intelligence report apparently also studied American capacity to sustain a war against China and concluded that the United States, fighting China by itself, would run out of equipment, munitions and missiles within about a week of a conventional war with China, and that if it was joined in that war by all its Asian allies, it would run out of equipment within about 2 weeks. So anyway, the Russians believe that the Americans do want to exit, and for that reason, the Russians who want the Americans to exit are leaving the door for them to go open. That, I think, is the true story of what we're seeing. Donald Trump, if he is wise, will walk out through that door. Whether he understands that himself or not, I don't know. And as I said, we'll just have to wait and see. He's apparently, according to the resident, given the Ukrainians 10 days. We'll see what happens at the end of those 10 days. If he continues to engage in negotiations beyond those 10 days, then I'm afraid I will conclude that he's never going to disengage. But I will say this, I hope he will. Well, this is my program for today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.